We have a couple of questions just about Oslo, and I'd love you to just elaborate a little more. Do you believe that Edward Said called Oslo a Palestinian Versailles? Do you believe from the beginning that it could never have produced a sovereign Palestinian state? And what do you think was what was fundamentally wrong with the structure of Oslo from your perspective?
If I had believed that it couldn't lead to anything, I wouldn't have spent a large part of 2 years involved in the negotiations in Madrid and Washington. So I obviously thought something could come of it, or I wouldn't have wasted my time. I changed my view after 2 years of interaction with the American diplomats who were in charge, the Dennis Rosses, the Aaron David Millers, the Kurtzers, and the others, Richard Haas, all of these folks, and Secretary Baker himself. And I realized that that was not a framework that was going to achieve Palestinian self-determination. In fact, it was designed to avoid doing that. It was a framework that really was based on Begin's autonomy proposals of 1978, 79, which were then incorporated into a treaty with Egypt, which were designed to give Israel the potential to take absolute sovereign control of the occupied territories and to prevent a Palestinian state. And that's what the Americans and the Israelis were really moving on the basis of. And I only realized that well into the process. And unfortunately, that realization did not penetrate the minds of the PLO leadership, and they signed onto what we in Washington were not willing to sign on to, which was a deal
You
that
as the
guaranteed.
Palestinian representatives in Washington.
I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation from October 1991 until June of 1993, when the 10 rounds of bilateral negotiations with the Israeli delegation ended. And then behind our backs, in the meantime, Arafat and Rabin had agreed to a different path, which led the PLO to accept what I found absolutely unacceptable terms that had been proposed to us by the Americans and the Israelis working together in Washington. I wrote about this in an op-ed I wrote in the New York Times in September of 1993. I said, this is not going to work. So I never wrote, Palestinian Versailles, but I basically agreed with that by the time I completed that experience. He was right.
Well, you mentioned Algeria. So, there are, if we take, this was, instead of the South Africa, Northern Ireland case where the settlers stayed, this is a case where the settlers left. I'm curious in which, and again, I should say that in my view, in my view, political Zionism is a settler colonial movement. I think it's not only a settler colonial movement. I think it's other things as well, but that's for another conversation.
I agree. It is other things. I mean, it's a national movement that's created a nation state.
Yes, and it created Jewish refuge,
which is common to settler colonial movements. I mean, we live in one of them, for heaven's sakes. There's not an American people. Hello, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, this can happen. Usually in conditions of extermination and genocide. Let it be understood.
Right. So that's exactly the question I wanted to ask you. So South Africa and Northern Ireland are one vision of how this plays out. Algeria is another. In which the settlers leave. The United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are another, in which the population that was there is so decimated that they're no longer a viable political entity. And I'm curious whether you think that either the Algeria result or the America result are not feasible, but could happen.
I think they're both very unlikely. I mean, there are fears and fantasies and traumatic concerns on the part of Palestinians, certainly, but also I think of Israelis, that one of those two extremes might come to be. I don't think either is likely. I think the resistance, not just of the Palestinians, but also of all the Arab countries to furthering Israel's aim of emptying Palestine as much as possible of its Arab population, is likely to prevent one extreme, which is the genocidal reduction of the Palestinian population to the point that it's no longer, as it is today, half or more than half of the population of what former mandate Palestine. And I seriously doubt there's any possibility of a nuclear-armed Israel ever being pushed into the sea or the settlers. It's not going to happen. Ain't going to happen, in my view. Neither of those is realistic. Does that prey on the mind of Palestinians and Israelis? Obviously it does. And in the Israeli case, it is being harped on by massed violins, which are raising every trauma in Jewish history. I'm surprised we haven't heard the Second Temple. We've had the pogroms, we've had Kishinev, we've had the Holocaust, we've had. I'm surprised we haven't had the Jews thrown out of England in the 12th century, or out of France in the 13th century, or out of Spain in the 15th century, thrown at us as what we should be afraid of, and therefore we should do whatever the government says and kill as many people as necessary to prevent this outcome, which is inevitable otherwise. Well, you have a propaganda machine working overtime doing that. In the Palestinian case, there is no organized propaganda machine, but those fears are being spread on social media and family to family. Anybody who talks to an older person, they say, "Oh, this is what happened to us in '67," or "This is what happened to us in '48." So, but I honestly don't think either of those extremes is likely at all, frankly. But who am I to say? The future, who knows?
Yeah.
I'm a historian.
To use this phrase that has become famous or notorious, depending on who you ask, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. So when people
did you see that Netanyahu used the same phrase?
Yes. Right. So, the thing is, when people say Israel from the river to the sea, we know what that means, because that's what we have now, right? We know that it means one apartheid state. But I think that since we don't have a Palestine from the river to the sea, it's theoretical. So the question I would ask you is, if someone said is Israel Palestine or Palestine Israel from the river to the sea, I would imagine they mean an equal binational state. If someone says Palestine from the river to the sea, is that harken back to the PLO's vision of a secular democratic Palestine? Does that mean the Israeli Jews become Palestinians? What does that mean? That idea?
That every person who uses the slogan probably has a different vision, and I don't think there's no unified Palestinian national movement. There's no clear Palestinian political objective, partly as a result of the hammering and smashing of Palestinian unity by every single external power in its own, serving its self-interest, preeminently Israel and Europe and the United States, but also every damn Arab and Middle Eastern power that's playing politics in Palestine. So you don't have a clear, there's no answer from a unified, the Israeli prime minister represents a parliament which was elected and can speak authoritatively on behalf of the Israeli people. Whether he represents them today in the polls or would win an election tomorrow is irrelevant. That's the government. You've got a president, you've got a prime minister, you've got a cabinet, you've got a parliament, the Knesset. They speak on behalf of that country as long as they're in power. You don't have anything similar. You have a Palestinian Authority that's supported by maybe 8% of the population, hated, despised by overwhelming majorities of Palestinians. They have complete contempt for them. And you have a leadership of Hamas which has never won a majority of Palestinian public opinion in any poll I've ever seen. Now, do you support what they did on the 7th? Yeah, but would you vote for them? They've never gotten. In 2005, they got 42.9% of the vote. That was the highest number they ever got. And if you look at their platform, they weren't getting it for armed resistance and an Islamic State. Their platform was so moderate you wouldn't believe it. I mean, it was completely didn't represent
Rashid,
what they necessarily really thought. But that's where they got 42%.
And that's because you just think most Palestinians don't believe in Islamism, political Islam.
Of course they don't. Of course they don't. I mean, the public opinion polls show that anyway. I don't know what people think, but I just, one has to go on the basis of the polls. But I think when you talk about from the river to the sea, you've got to finish the slogan, Palestine will be free.
Right.
So the alternative is Palestine being unfree, which is the situation today. It doesn't necessarily mean Palestinians are thinking, I want this kind of binational state with this. They say, we want to be free. That's what it is. It's a slogan talking about the absolute contradiction of the present reality, which is complete unfreedom of some sort for all Palestinians, whether they're expelled from Palestine, whether they live under occupation, or whether they're second-class citizens inside of Israel. They obviously don't feel free. They're not free to talk or demonstrate, for example. They don't have the right to purchase land. They don't, so they're in various ways. Even they who have rights within Israel, who vote and so on and so forth, who form a large part of the medical sector and the pharmaceutical sector and a ton of engineers and teachers and accountants and God knows what, even they don't feel themselves to be equal and free within Israel. And then the rest are even obviously much more deprived of freedom. So that's from a post-Palestinian's perspective, that's the main thrust of the slogan. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's not from the river to the sea, who's going to govern? I don't think most people frankly are thinking about that. And if they are, I promise you, they have a very diverse set of views as to what, if anything, that means.
I'd love you to talk about, Saeed said that to be a Palestinian in the West is to be a kind of an outlaw. And I wonder if you feel that still today, being at an American prestigious university, or whether you think it's changing, and that's not the case in the way that it might have been in the past.
No, I think it is changing for the better, because with young people, with people on college campuses, with a very large part of the intellectual elite in the United States, with most minorities in the United States, with ordinary working people in the United States, 4 unions have come out for a ceasefire, the UAW, unreported by the mass media, by the way. The only one that was ever mentioned was the UAW. Nurses, electricians, postal workers, diverse, large, working class unions and UAW have come out for a ceasefire. So, are Palestinians outcasts in American society as a whole? Well, not as far as a lot of working people and a lot of minorities and a lot of young people are concerned. Now, when you talk about the commanding heights of our society, the media, yes, obviously. The people who own the media and the 70 and 65-year-olds who determine what is on the screen and what the reporter is going to be asked to write and the framing of the article and where it goes and all of that, they regard us as, negatively. And that's true of our political elite, and that's true of the corporate elite, and that's true of the people who run American universities and who are answering to the people who own the universities. Private universities are owned as corporations by their boards of trustees. They're legally liable. They own us. We think that the faculty and the students are the university. No. The money is the university. These are private universities, like the art galleries and like, all of the foundations. The people who donate to them and are on their boards control them. And those people are not friendly to Palestinian rights. So do I feel that things have changed? Yes. I would never have seen 4 unions come out for a ceasefire 20, 30, 40 years ago. I would never have seen majorities vote in favor of BDS on a dozen or more American university campuses. I would never have seen this scholarly treatment of Palestine shift from it's not there or it's treated hostilely to a much more fair and balanced and open and realistic understanding of that. The Journal of Palestine Studies, which I co-edit, I'm stepping down actually from that job, has about 250,000 downloads every year. Now, that could not have been possible 30 or 40 years ago. First of all, you didn't have downloads. But that many people would be reached by that kind of an academic media. And these are mainly, peer-reviewed, long research articles. But that's what people writing PhDs and writing MAs and writing BA theses and studying Palestine have access to and are using. And that wasn't possible several decades ago. It didn't exist. So yeah, things have changed enormously in the United States, in my view, for the better. Especially among young people, but the commanding heights are still controlled by people who are fundamentally hostile to Palestinian rights and who are extraordinarily sympathetic to and influenced by the Israeli narrative.
And what impact do you think? I mean, that those forces have also now have suspended and banned chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine at different universities, including your own.
Right.
What do you think is the state of free speech at Columbia?
There's somebody at the door. I have to.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No
I
problem.
will be right back. I believe there's some action taking place on the campus today, and I just have to answer to this. Just 1 minute. I'm really
no. Go ahead. Don't worry about it.
Talk among yourselves. I'll be right back.
I'll filibuster.
I'm coming.
No worries. I'll just wait till Rashid is back, and remind people that again, our guest next week is going to be Karen Attiah, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, and Terrell Starr, who's a journalist who now has his own Substack. Both of them have been writing some really interesting stuff about Israel-Palestine, but especially about the kind of changing nature of Black political discourse in the United States on this subject. So that's going to be next Friday at noon. I think as I filibuster a little more, I mean, I think that it's really, I think one of the things that's so valuable. There's so many things that's valuable of talking about Rashid, but one of them is just that he has been doing this for such a long time. And so I think he has a historical perspective. And I was really struck. I mean, he said it today, but I've heard him say it in other interviews, that I think it's precisely because he's been following this debate in the US so close for such a long time that he's actually more optimistic than many, many younger people are, because they don't remember how bad it was in terms of the U.S. public discourse around this in the 1980s or the 1970s, when there were, when it was difficult to even assert that Palestinians were a people. And so I think that's, for me, one of the things that's really
sorry about that, folks.
No problem. So free speech at Columbia and more broadly in the universities.
Well, I mean, you can see what's happening at the top level. You can see with the resignations of 2 of the 3 university presidents who spoke to a House committee that, first of all, this has to do with Palestine, but secondly, it's part of a much larger offensive against higher education on the part of the Republican right. At the same time, it has worked itself out on most college campuses in terms of, as you've said, suppression of free speech and suppression of academic freedom. We've had university events organized by faculty, stopped, canceled, questioned by administrators. It's not just students who are having their free expression interfered with. That too. I mean, we had 18 deans at Columbia shamefully signing something in which they said that certain expressions are hurtful to people. Especially to Jewish and Israeli students. I think they used the terms intifada, all means necessary, and from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I wrote a response to these 18 deans. But what
maybe we can put that in the chat response.
Pardon me?
I'm just asking Ken to put your response in the chat.
Yeah,
I think
I mean, this is part of an effort to silence students, and what they're doing with faculty is more sinister and much more surreptitious. You ban SJP, everybody knows about it. You ban Jewish Voices for Peace, everybody knows about it. They don't know about how the Beinart president or the dean of the School of General Studies did this, that, or the other to stop the faculty from doing things, or call them in and interrogate them about this or that speaker. It's an outrageous violation of academic freedom, and it only operates in one direction. I mean, we have demonstrators calling Palestinian people supporting Palestinian rights terrorists and Hamas supporters and saying horrible, nasty things. I mean, who cares? It's hurtful, but that shouldn't be the miqyas, the thing determining political speech. What's miqyas? The standard for determining political speech. Hurtful? I mean, every time Trump opened his mouth, he's hurting people. Nobody cares. That's political speech. But there are forms of political speech which are effectively, we're being told, inappropriate and are not to be used. So, and so seeing a keffiyeh makes me feel bad. Well, seeing an Israeli flag makes me feel bad. Who the hell cares how I feel about an Israeli flag? It's nobody's business if I'm hurt or offended by seeing some symbol or some statement or some whatever. But that's what's driving a lot of these universities. You have donors, you have trustees, you have alumni, you have a tiny number of students for whom this is absolutely essential, that this stuff be stamped out. I mean, they can't argue. How are you going to defend 56 years of occupation? How are you going to defend administrative detention? How are you going to defend the burning of the town of Hawara by settlers? How are you going to defend a dozen or 20 or so Palestinian communities expelled from their property over the last 3 months? You can't defend these things. They're indefensible. How do you defend killing 30,000 Palestinians? You can't defend them. So you shut down the speech of the people who are trying to raise these issues. And, you know, it has not been very effective. I don't think it is going to work. In fact, it's going to probably lead to a boomerang effect.
You have, I mean, I feel like one of the stories that, as you say, that there's a kind of industry out there that is invested in telling the story of pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses is something that is menacing to Jewish students. But you have been teaching, you know, you've been teaching classes on these subjects for many, many, many years. You've probably, you know, classes that have, you know, you've taught and mentored, you know, probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish students, along with students from all other different backgrounds. Tell me when you teach these classes and you structure discussions and you talk to students, what do you see?
I mean, I've seen an enormous change over time. I teach a course in modern Middle East history every year, which has between 200 and 300 students a year, at least 200. So I probably taught 4,000 students in this course over 20 years. And it has a component, only one part of it, a couple of weeks, are devoted to Palestine and Israel. And, you know, most students are, you know, Columbia has a very diverse student body. We have a lot of students from different countries. Some of them are Arab, some of them are Indian, some of them are Chinese. We have a large number of Jewish students. We have a large number of Black students. We have a large number of veterans. Columbia has the largest number of veterans, U.S. Army veterans of any Ivy League school. So, you know, it's a very diverse group. I mean, I get a student every year who has served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Sometimes during the height of the war, maybe a dozen or half dozen, not a dozen. So, you know, it's diverse. We have a lot of Israeli students, especially since the School of General Studies did a deal with Tel Aviv University. So we had dozens of Israelis go back to serve. Dozens. I don't know how many. I don't know the number, but a lot. A couple dozen, I don't know. A ton of people. And I have had, you know, very, very few negative reactions in 20 years of teaching this. I will say the level of knowledge and openness and understanding of that student body has grown measurably over those 2 decades.
I wonder what it's like for you, what it is particularly like for you to teach students who have coming from having been in the IDF.
I mean, it's interesting, obviously. They're older, and that's actually positive because they do have a little bit of experience. Some of them I don't have any interaction with, I assume. I don't, you know, it's a class of 200 people. The ones who deal with them on a daily basis would be their TAs. I know the ones who ask questions in class. I always take questions in class. And I know the ones who come and see me during office hours. And I know from my TAs exactly what's going on in their classes because I meet with them every week and we discuss in detail what's happening with each group of undergraduates. I teach the graduate students myself because it's a graduate section in this course. And I mean, I've had some amazing interactions with IDF veterans. I mean, one of them was a woman who was an officer and who taught in sniping.
Wow.
She was a sniping instructor, sniper instructor. Another one of them was teaching young men to drive armored personnel carriers. And I kept asking, why do they have women doing this? He said, the boys listen better. That's what the psychologists, Army psychologists say. Anyway, those are obviously people whose thinking has evolved since they were serving in the IDF. And I've had many students like that. The ones who haven't, I guess they don't talk to me. Or they're the ones who write the negative when we, you know, we get the evaluations, they write the negative evaluations.
How do you explain the fact that for so many people of so many different backgrounds, this question of the Palestinian struggle, especially recently, has become so important to them, and seems to be becoming kind of definitional for a lot of people about in terms of what it means to be a progressive. Why do you think it's a very small place? You know, it's not at the center of global power struggle, which is probably in East Asia somewhere. Why this resonance?
I think, first of all, we're talking about the impact mainly on young people. And we have to think about a generation or generation and a half that grew up in the wake of Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter, Me Too pandemic. And they have a thirst for justice. I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about most of the young people who are active and involved and who feel this way about Palestine. They have a thirst for justice, and they see things as linked. So this idea of intersectionality, which is a political activist idea, it also is an intellectual thing for many of these younger people. They see Native Americans and they understand something about settler colonialism, and they see racism and discrimination, and they learn about Jim Crow, and they see how women are treated in the patriarchy, and they've been affected by all these things at a young, what's the word, age where they're particularly susceptible to feeling strongly about these things, climate as well, and they see all of it as linked. And for them, somehow Palestine fits it in an intersection of several of these concerns for justice in particular. They see it as particularly unjust, I should say. Why Palestine in particular and not other? I don't know. I mean, it could be that it keeps being thrust into their view.
Yeah.
Over the past 8 or 10 years, the number of attacks on Gaza and the greater prominence of an understanding of things like what is Jewish supremacy? What are these settlements really about? What is actually going on in Gaza? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have a good answer to it. But the background to it is what I said, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that, that the U.S. is a settler colony, a very successful one. And one of the things that I've been thinking a little bit about is what it would mean. I'm very struck that when I read Palestine solidarity literature, they refer to the United States, often the U.S. is referred to as Turtle Island. So there is an effort so what would it mean for Americans to take the Palestinian struggle and then refract it back on us? And how should Americans be thinking about what we need to do in the United States, given what we've done to our native population, that we could learn from a place where the settler colonial experience has not reached the same kind of end result that it's reached here?
I think that a lot of young people see, in particular, issues of race and issues of settler colonialism as feeding back into their understanding of the United States. I hear this from Black intellectuals and Black students. I hear it from Native Americans. I hear it from ordinary kids, ordinary students, that yes, this should make us reflect. When we talk about apartheid there, well, what about segregation here? De facto segregation. What about racial discrimination here? When we talk about settler colonialism in Palestine, well, what does that mean in terms of Native Americans and so on and so forth? So I do think it's refracted back, frankly, for many of these young people anyway.
Yeah. One of the things that has always struck me about you since the first time I met you and all the years that I've been reading you and came through in this conversation too, is your generosity of spirit. You're talking about teaching students a student who was a sniper, who could have shot your own relatives, and you speak about it in almost a kind of—
not her students. She wasn't a sniper. She was a sniper.
Okay. She taught people how to do that.
Yes.
And yet you're not saying, I will not teach this person. You're not even saying I hold them in contempt.
I only found this out after I had taught her, by the way, when she came in to talk to me.
But you also made a point in your first answer, when you were talking about what was happening in Gaza, of talking about how traumatic it was for Israeli friends of yours, who had family who had been—
or American friends
been killed. So I'm just curious, this is clearly a moment when the ability to be generous and empathetic is very, very difficult for a lot of people, given the amount of trauma and agony and rage. And I'm just curious, how do you maintain that spirit under those circumstances?
I mean, look, a lot of younger people I know don't have what you just called that generosity of spirit. They are so angry at what they see happening to their families or to people they know, And some of them are there. I mean, I'm talking about young people I know in Palestine and others who have family there. And many of them don't know Israelis, and many of them don't know people in the American Jewish community. I mean, I was born in New York. I grew up here. Several of the colleagues who are the most involved with what we're doing on campus as faculty for justice in Palestine, they're Israeli. So, I mean, it's different for me than for one of my nephews or for some student who's literally never had a Jewish friend. I mean, I grew up in Mount Vernon, for God's sakes. Half my friends were Jewish. A little more than half, actually. So obviously it's different for somebody as old as I am and with this specific background to someone who has a completely different, a disconnect from American life, a complete disconnect from Israeli life. Nobody under the age of about 30 in Palestine has ever seen an Israeli except with a gun as a settler or a soldier, ever in their entire life. Whether they cross through the Allenby Bridge or whether they cross through checkpoints or however they don't go into Israel, most of them. They can't. They're not allowed to. So they don't see Israelis except soldiers and settlers. And most people who grew up in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Syria or wherever in the Arab world, they don't know Israelis. They've never seen any Israelis. You know, the young people now are coming to realize that some of our strongest allies in the United States are young people in the American Jewish community. And this is like a revelation to some of them. And this has been really wonderful watching. On our campus, they work together very closely. On most campuses, on many campuses, I don't know most campuses, the ones I know of, they work fairly closely together, SJP and JVP. And for a lot of these young people who come out of, whether they come out of communities in the Middle East or whether they come out of Arab American communities. I mean, if you're in Patterson, you don't have a lot of Jewish friends. If you're in Dearborn, if you're in Bridgeview, Illinois, if you're in neighborhoods I know in Houston, we're talking about large Arab American communities of tens and tens and tens of thousands where you can walk down the street and speak Arabic every day and never have a problem. But even those kids who are the most assimilated and the most, they may not even speak Arabic, but they don't have the same experiences. They come to campus and they find that their strongest allies are either Jewish or Black or gay or whatever. It's going to change their perspective. But to expect them to have the same attitude that I have, having been born here in the 1940s, is you can't expect that.
Yeah. My last question is, I wonder if you could just suggest for folks a Palestinian novel, play, film. But I mean, I know you could literally thousands, but just something that comes to your head if folks wanted to, who may not be as deeply versed, that you think might give them a taste of Palestinian culture and experience.
I'm gonna do a little tooting of my own horn and suggest people look at my son's plays.
Wonderful.
Tennis and Nablus. He has two or three that are Palestinian themed. A play that he and Naomi Wallace adapted from a novel by Ghassan Kanafani, Return to Haifa. They should read Kanafani. I mean, Return to Haifa is a novel about two Palestinians in the West Bank who are able to go back to Haifa for the first time after the '67 war. And they will go back to their house and they find a Holocaust survivor living in it. And they're searching for their son, whom they were forced to leave behind in the chaos of the expulsion of 70,000 Palestinians from Haifa in 1948. So the novel is about this interaction between them, this woman, and ultimately their son, who shows up. And I won't spoil the play or the novel for you. So I would recommend Ghassan. I would recommend my son's works. I would recommend any poetry there's a whole ton of really great poets. Darwish, obviously, Mahmoud Darwish, obviously. Barghouti. There's a couple of really fine poets out there. Fadwa Tu'an. Novels, read Rashid Khalidi. Rashid Khalidi has some wonderful novels in English. Adani Shibli, Ibtisam A'azam. There's a bunch of wonderful Palestinian. Suad Amiri. There's a bunch of novelists and writers out there who are well worth reading. Any of the ones I mentioned, I would strongly recommend.
Thank you so much for doing this. I actually found it one of the most hopeful, actually, conversations that I've had since October 7th, and one of the most moving. And thank you, Rashid, so much.
I'm very welcome. I'm hopeful too. I mean, I honestly think that something better could come of this, but it's not going to be easy. And we really have to push hard. We have to push at the people who govern us. We have to push at the people who control some of these powerful institutions.
Yes, I agree. I agree. Thank you all very, very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for having me. Take care.